All right. Good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I see that we are at the 2 o'clock Eastern time. So at this time, we are going to begin today's webinar. So thank you again for joining us. My name is Adam Ash. I'm with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. And as your technical host, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to go through some of the features of the WebEx platform. Again, this webinar is the legalization of marijuana and its adverse impact on youth, and it is being presented by the National District Attorneys Association. If you're interested in prior webinars, you can view these on OJJDP's NTech YouTube page by following the link on this slide. For transcript and supporting materials, you may contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk at OJJDP@TTA@USDOJ.gov. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube as well for future reference. Just some brief webinar tips before we begin. If you have trouble accessing any of the materials or you are requesting those, you can do so by contacting the help desk. For optimal audio, please dial out through WebEx to your phone line. This will help enhance your experience. And if you have any technical difficulties, please send a private message and we'll attempt to troubleshoot those for you. During today's presentation, we will have a Q&A session. Please send your questions through the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. Finally, if you could please help us count if you're viewing with someone, please enter the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are signed in on this webinar alone, there is no need to do anything at this time. I want to let you know that you will be receiving a certificate of attendance if you are signed in on this WebEx platform. However, if you are one of those attendees that has joined someone in a group, we will be providing you with a group validation form that you will need to complete and return to the OJJDP Help Desk. Finally, walking through here the agenda, we've gone through the opening remarks, and then I will turn it over here briefly to Rachel Larson, who is our substitute moderator. Unfortunately, Susan Broderick could not be with us today, but I know Rachel will do a great job filling in. We will then turn it over to our presenter from Smart Approaches to Marijuana, Luke Niforatos, and then we'll have a Q&A session, as mentioned prior, and then we'll close it out and discuss some next steps and conclude this webinar. So at this time, I would like to turn it over to Rachel Larson, who is a senior attorney at the National District Attorneys Association.
Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Larson. I'm a senior attorney with the National District Attorneys Association. Susan Broderick is my boss, and I'm subbing in for her here today. I started my career as an assistant district attorney in Durham, North Carolina, where I handled juvenile court cases and child sex abuse cases. I then started work as a North Carolina Conference of District Attorneys resource prosecutor. I was there for 6 years training prosecutors all across North Carolina and how to handle juvenile court cases and child sexual abuse cases. So I've also handled conflict cases across the state of North Carolina and just joined NDAA 2 weeks ago. So I'm fresh off the presses here for you today. And it's my honor to be able to introduce our accomplished speaker, who is Luke Niforatos. Luke is the Executive Vice President at Smart Approaches to Marijuana. The New York Times called his organization the well-coordinated opposition to the legalization of marijuana. He has a background in nonprofit community healthcare and is co-founder of a healthcare startup called DocBuddy. In 2018, he was the campaign manager for the successful campaign to defeat legalization in North Dakota and numerous other legislative victories across the United States. He lives in Colorado and thus has a unique vantage point on the issues around marijuana legalization. Today we're going to talk to you about the importance of addressing marijuana use in juvenile court. This slide is an important one because it shows that in 2019 alone, there was a 2.8% increase in marijuana use disorder amongst the 12 to 17-year-olds. And that represents 200,000 more American children who were addicted to marijuana in 2019 than the year before. The juvenile justice system plays a key role in this problem. In fact, the juvenile justice system has untapped potential to serve as an early interception and turning point for youth with substance issues. I'm hearing that you can't hear me again.
I can hear you just fine.
I saw in a chat that, okay, great, maybe it's just a one-off situation. Wonderful. Okay, great. So I will keep charging forward here. The reason that juvenile court is so important is because juvenile court is a gatekeeper to the system. Prosecutors should be aware of research and latest policy developments in order to be a knowledgeable gatekeeper. Specifically, as a community leader and prosecutor, you can lead community prevention efforts. You can make important intake and charging decisions. For example, you can decide if cases involving marijuana are diverted, or if they are diverted, what kind of programs youth in your jurisdiction are put into to address the marijuana addiction issues that they may have. And in disposition, you as a prosecutor can make important recommendations for marijuana treatment. The role of the prosecutor, as we all know, is evolving, and one important role is what we do outside of the courtroom. And by understanding the adverse consequences of adolescent marijuana, we can more effectively respond to our community and identify problems in our courtrooms for earlier intervention and solution. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Niforatos. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Rachel, thank you so much for your wonderful introduction. And I want to thank NDAA as well for having me, for the honor of getting a chance to speak with every single one of you on the webinar today. I want to thank you for your time. I am from Colorado, so I've lived and continue to live legalization of marijuana firsthand. I have a growing family. I've got one daughter who's 4. I'm going to talk a little bit about her in a little bit here. And I have another daughter on the way. So pray for me. I will be outnumbered, but I'm excited for it. Experiencing this firsthand, I think, gives me a unique perspective. I also spent a number of years, actually my entire career, working in healthcare and public health, from different kind of capacities and different angles, but always kind of working for the health of society, which is why I am passionate about this issue. I think it's important to note, too, that there's so much that you all as members of law enforcement and touching this issue in different ways, whoever you are, there's so much we can do to address the underlying issues of substance use, whether it's marijuana or anything else. But what we can all agree is, treating these problems is important. Treating them as problems is much more important, and not allowing for the encouragement and the profit incentive structure to be baked into that process. That is a very big concern, I think, as we look to future policy changes. So I am Luke Niforatos. Just a quick little introduction to my organization. For those of you who don't know us, we are SAM. We're the largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working on this issue from the perspective of public health. We were co-founded by former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, David Frum, my boss, our president, Dr. Kevin Sabet, who was on the Obama and Clinton and Bush administrations. And we're led by a scientific advisory board of people from Harvard and Princeton and Yale doing research on marijuana, as we speak, literally, and who guide our work. And we put a lot of information toward that end. We're on in the press and the media, quite often, kind of pushing forth a different perspective on this issue, which I'll get into. We have 2 organizations. Our 501c3, SAM, that I just described, our 501c4, SAM Action, which does a lot of our policy work, lobbying and et cetera at the federal level, as well as at the state and local levels, working, as was mentioned before, on ballot issues, as well as working with legislators on bills at the state, federal level. And speaking of that, we actually are involved in, there's a vote that's going to likely happen today in the House on expanding research into marijuana, which we're very excited about. We've always pushed for continued research, because the research tells us that marijuana is not this harmless, benign substance plant that's in the ground that we're kind of told it is. The research continues to tell us we should have great concern about this. So we're excited about that bill, which we are very much involved with moving forward. We've collaborated with basically every medical society. I will say the American Medical Association issued a letter recently that I encourage you all to read. on their views on marijuana legalization. They actually just released it last week. And so we worked with them. We've worked with a number of other organizations and associations as well in public health and law enforcement and beyond. So, before I jump into, I really want to kind of focus on the youth issue, but before getting into that, I think we need to kind of encapsulate this issue and really make sure we're thinking about it the right way. Oftentimes we fall into, in our country, this kind of false dichotomy between you either throw everybody in prison or you totally legalize and commercialize it Colorado style, and there's really no in between. We reject that notion. It's a false dichotomy when it comes to this policy issue of marijuana. Really what this comes down to is three buckets, we think. The first being the penalization and criminalization of users and possession. And, really when it comes to that, we need to be thinking, and again, I think your slides at the beginning, Rachel alluded to this, we need to be thinking about how to get people who are living with addiction the help they need. And, if a kid is making a mistake at a young age and is falling into addiction, we want to get that child help. And hopefully that child is not going to spend, time in jail. Hopefully we can get them the help they need to avoid that. So, but that is one issue that we need to address. It is separate from the potential medicinal uses for compounds derived from marijuana. So, oftentimes we hear about medical marijuana it being voted on, and that's the first time in this country's history we've ever voted on medications. I don't remember voting on anything else. Maybe you do. But this is an important issue on the medical side because the FDA has approved, many of you may not know this, the FDA has approved several marijuana-based medications that you can get prescriptions for. Marinol, which is pure THC, that's the ingredient that can get you high. Then Epidiolex, which is pure CBD, and a few other medications. And we support that scientific, process for medications, the FDA process. But when you hear the term medical marijuana, what they're talking about is actually really not anything to do with science or regulation or medications. It's really just legalizing an industry to sell joints and gummies and other edibles and calling that medicine. So it's important we make that distinction. But that is a second bucket of this conversation. And then the final bucket is, should there be, recreational use of marijuana, non-medical. And obviously that's not an idea we're a big fan of. So I spell these things out because quite often we hear, let's stop locking people up, so let's legalize marijuana for recreational use, for example. And you can see that that's conflating two separate issues. If we've got an issue with, the way criminalization penalties work for low-level possession and et cetera, we can address that on its own merits. That doesn't mean we need to legalize it and commercialize it. And the same notion goes, they say marijuana is medicine, so let's legalize it let's legalize medical marijuana. Again, those are two separate issues because they're talking about commercializing this drug and putting it to a vote, whereas real medicine should not go to a vote. It needs to be validated by science so that it's not tainted and harming people unnecessarily, which is why we created the FDA, for those who remember the history there. So I just wanted to spell those issues out so we're all kind of thinking along the same lines here as we get into this discussion. See if I can get this slide going now. So why this matters, Rachel mentioned this, we're seeing increases in addiction. The rates of daily use of marijuana have skyrocketed just in the last 20 years. So from 1990 to today, from that age group, 12 and up, it was, back in 1992, it was 900,000 daily users of marijuana. It is now up to 9 million daily users of marijuana. So we are seeing an astronomical increase in the use of marijuana, an astronomical increase in addiction rates to marijuana across the board. And so these are reasons why we need to take a hard look at policy changes that are being made by some of these states and really be careful when it comes to marijuana, reform. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction here. Sorry. Marijuana reforms. Another study that should give us pause is JAMA just released this. Actually, Dr. Kamer, who led this study, is a friend of Sam's, found that if we federally legalized marijuana, we would see about 7,000 more stone driving deaths per year. So to put that into perspective and give you some context, with alcohol, we have about 10,000 people who die from drunk drivers every year in this country. So you're talking about almost doubling that number. And I think most people are pretty concerned about drunk driving right now. So this would be adding an additional issue there. A lot of stuff I'm going to talk about today and a lot more will come from our report we just released last month. Our impact report looks at all the stats that come out of states that have legalized marijuana. I encourage you to get that. It's free. on our website, learnaboutsam.org. And again, I mentioned this false dichotomy. We need to stay away from this idea that you either throw everybody in prison or totally commercialize it. There's a lot more to it. So getting into kind of some of the youth stuff here, this was a poignant quote I thought from The Economist. And The Economist has some interesting perspectives on drugs, but I thought this was a very interesting quote. It said, while laboratory animals are an expensive way of understanding the risks of cannabis use, North Americans come free. What do they mean by that? Well, we have allowed a number of states, about 14 states, to legalize recreational marijuana and about 30 states to legalize some form of medical marijuana. And we've allowed them to do this without understanding what the products are that are being sold on these markets, with no federal oversight and regulation, with very little state level oversight and regulation. We have allowed these products to be sold, this addictive drug, psychoactive drug, to be sold and used and develop addiction in our country. And so, you know, in other countries right now, which, by the way, there's only one country in the world that's federally legalized marijuana, and that's Canada. And I don't know if you saw the recent data there, but it's not going well. But nonetheless, only one country's that. So every other country, they are doing the research and the studies and other things. Here in America, we are subjecting a large portion of our populace to basically a wildly out of control experiment with, well, let's hope it works out here in 20, 30 years and that we don't regret allowing these products to be sold and used widely. So very, very poignant quote, I thought. So where are we in the research with you? Because I think a lot of times, and being from Colorado, my state is widely cited. The Colorado Healthy Kids Survey that you see here towards the bottom, widely cited by the industry and saying, well, you know, youth use of marijuana didn't go up, is what the industry says. And they point to my state's Colorado Healthy Kids Survey. Well, I want to dive into that misnomer, and I will dive into that just a little bit here. I have several slides on it because I think it needs to be discussed in depth. However, you look at the greater body of research out there, and I've given you some really good stuff. NSDA, it's put out by SAMHSA. That's really the gold standard when it comes to data on youth use and attitudes towards drug use. You got Monitoring the Future, MTF, which is probably the second most credible national research that's done on drugs. You have a number of other excellent research studies as well here. We are seeing pretty much across the board that youth use is going up in different ways. Now, the picture is mixed because it's very early. We've only had about 6 or 7 years of legalization in this country because my state, Colorado, and Washington State legalized back in 2012. That went live in 2014. So we're still extremely early on, particularly when you think about scientific research. It takes decades for that to kind of come together and us to get a clear picture. And just think of tobacco. I mean, that's really the best comparison case. It took us about 50 to 75 years to realize we were boiling the frog, and millions of people have died since. So we should think about that case study there. However, what we're seeing is a lot of high schoolers are using more marijuana. We're seeing increases in the concerning methods of using marijuana, which I'll get into, like dabbing and vaping and some of those other things. But everything we're seeing is pretty much telling us that youth use is going up slightly right now, and we're seeing bigger increases at some of the state level. But when you kind of aggregate it across the national picture, we're seeing that youth use and the attitudes towards marijuana are very, very concerning. So I'm going to dive into that. And before I do that, this is that 4-year-old daughter I was talking about. Her name is Shiloh. We took this picture a few months ago. And I wanted to put this picture not just to show you how much I love my wonderful little fuzzy-headed tornado, I call her, and she is a tornado. But I put this here for another reason as well, because when we're thinking about the marijuana issue, and we have to put our youth at the center of our thinking on this, and kind of how is this going to impact the next generation? And we both have masks on in this picture, and I will tell you right now, we're not parents of the year. This was one of the few times we've been able to get her to wear her mask, and so I was counting this as a victory. But I thought this was poignant because as parents, I'm trying to explain to my daughter, who is 4, why she needs to wear this weird mask. And obviously she does not get it. She doesn't understand why she needs to wear this mask. But as her parent, I know that it's safe for her to do this. It's going to help protect her, and it's going to help protect others. And so because of this knowledge, and I've been equipped with the facts as an adult and as a citizen in this country, I'm making the responsible decision, and I'm trying to help my daughter to wear her mask. And so we have to think about that, what we're doing in COVID-19 in this era, and not just do this for COVID-19. We need to think about this for marijuana too, and for other issues of public safety and public health. She needs, our children may not know all the facts about marijuana, but we know them. We've been empowered with this information. How can we then take that information and then deploy that and help our next generation avoid getting caught up in the issues of marijuana and in other drugs and addiction? So hopefully that makes sense, but I just felt like this picture kind of encapsulated that for me. One thing we do know is, again, as I mentioned, youth use is going up. Our United States Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams, he issued a historic advisory late last year. First advisory from the Surgeon General's office on marijuana in 40 years. And he basically said two things that were key concerns for him. One is the potency of marijuana has skyrocketed since we've seen marijuana legalized, because the industry is making it much more potent. And I'll get into that in a second. But we've also seen that pregnant mothers and youth are using at the highest and most alarming rates we've seen in quite a long time in this country. So very, very concerning for pregnant mothers and youth particularly, and so that's why, we're talking about this. One of the things we hear is that, legalizing marijuana is going to help with our opiate crisis. And I think this is something that we hear quite often, but what we're seeing from the research is if you're a regular user of marijuana, starting at any age, actually the younger you start, it's even worse, you're 2.7 times more likely to go on and abuse opioids. So not to say that marijuana is a gateway drug, you're going to smoke a joint and then you're going to inject heroin. That's not the point of this research, but really what the research shows us is there is an obvious and definite link between drug use. And so to ignore that, somebody's just going to use marijuana, or people who use heroin, they just started using heroin and that's the only drug they've ever used. That's not the case. In fact, the research tells us over 90% of people who use crack and heroin and other drugs started with marijuana. So not to say that every single person who uses marijuana is going to go and use it, but there's clearly a pathway, and marijuana tends to be a pathway to other drugs. It's just how it works. Another interesting study that came out from JAMA last year was that actually states that have legalized medical marijuana, they were associated with actually an increase in opioid overdose deaths. So we had heard some initial research from JAMA, a research study that was published in JAMA in 2014, said that actually it had gone, they were saying, in the industry widely touted this, they said, the opioid overdose deaths are going down, and so this is why everyone should legalize. But then this study was updated again with 5 more years of data, and as you can see, the trend was reversed. So this is an important teaching moment for all of us. We shouldn't jump to conclusions based on research, especially with this issue being so new and the industry being so new. We need a lot more time to get an idea of what happens when you legalize marijuana, and the research takes time. So we shouldn't rush into this. Finally, I'll just note that here in my state, it's gone up every single year. Opioid overdose deaths have since legalization. Not saying you legalize marijuana and that causes increases in opioid overdose deaths, though it might. But what the research is showing us is that it certainly hasn't led to a decrease in overdose deaths. And so we have to dispense with that common myth. So getting into kind of how marijuana impacts our brain has endocannabinoid receptors all throughout. And these receptors are what take in that THC, that ingredient when you use marijuana that gets you high. And these receptors are responsible for a wide array of very important functions in the human body. And these functions, appetite, immune system, et cetera, they're important. So if marijuana use has long-term sustained damage to these functions, that has implications for society that we have to consider. What I mentioned before in terms of the Surgeon General's concerns about potency, this is what I'm talking about. These are the kinds of products now that are proliferating on the marijuana markets. You have these butane hash oils, which have caused explosions in the past. Shatter, which is very, very popular here in Colorado and elsewhere. These are how they're getting marijuana's potency so much higher. And I think we hear this kind of idea that it's just a joint and whatever, but it's not just a joint anymore. It is a genetically modified, genetically bred product now that is so much more potent than it ever was before. In fact, the potency now, that graph on the top left's a little small, but it started out about 2 to 3% potency on average. These joints were back in the Woodstock years, the hippies, all that stuff. Now we're headed to where the average is upwards of 50% for a lot of these concentrates, and we have products being sold that are upwards of 99% potency THC. So it is a totally different drug now. So this whole idea of it kind of being no big deal, and maybe you were around in those days and you smoked a joint, fell asleep and all that. That is not what we're talking about anymore. This is a totally different drug, and it is much more addictive than it's ever been before. And to kind of give you a comparison, a researcher, Jonathan Calkins, gave a great example, I thought, of saying the average kind of daily user of marijuana back in I think it was the 1980s, I believe was his comparison. Back in the 1980s, it was the equivalent of, if you compare THC to caffeine, the equivalent of using about a Diet Cola a day, okay, worth of THC. Diet Cola is worth of caffeine. Now compare that to today, the average daily user is consuming about 33 medium cappuccinos worth of caffeine. So compare that caffeine to THC. That's the difference in potency from the 1980s to today. So huge increase in the amount of potency, huge increase in the amount of THC that's being consumed by users. And you take this and then you combine that with what we were showing you earlier, that Rachel showed you as well as I did, about the increase in daily users. That takes on a whole different perspective because they're taking in more THC and more highly potent THC than they ever have in the existence, really, of the United States. So it's something we've got to watch for. There are a lot of research studies I could talk about that I won't bore you with on kind of the impact with mental illness and other things. This is just a preliminary listing you can check out when you get these slides afterward. But I want to focus on really the highlighted study for this, and that's from the Lancet Journal of Psychiatry. That is probably the foremost journal really in the world when it comes to issues of psychology. And what they found, this was a landmark population level study last year that they released. And they did population level research in London and New York and a couple of other major metropolitan areas. And what they found was daily, regular users of today's high potency marijuana, and this was why it was so unprecedented, because it was one of the first big studies to look at the high potency stuff versus the low potency stuff. The high potency marijuana users were more than 5 times more likely to develop psychosis or other forms of mental illness. Big, big concern. And that's compared to just 3 times more likely for users of the lower potency regular stuff. So this study revealed to us that there is an increase in the harm from this higher potency drug. And the more research that comes out on this, we're going to learn a lot more. I mentioned the mental illness tie-in. It gets worse for youth. So I highlighted their earlier age of use correlates with this higher a risk of schizophrenia. So you see this, if you start using marijuana by the age of 15, you are 4.5 times more likely, according to this study, to develop schizophrenia. And we're seeing that not just with youth, but also with adults as well. And we shouldn't separate those two things. This drug we're finding, especially as it becomes more potent, is having a big impact on mental illness particularly. Another study from JAMA that was published in 2019 found that it contributes to, use of marijuana contributes to depression among all age groups. It also didn't substitute for some of these other drugs that people were using. We're now kind of getting, and I mentioned research, it takes a long time to get a full picture of what's going on. One of the key things with research, which some of you may know, is they don't like to use the word causal. They like to say that their findings found, that marijuana use was associated, or maybe there was a correlation, but they really avoid the C word, causal. Okay, but we're now seeing research studies that are using this term causal, which is why I highlighted it, finding that the relationship between use of marijuana has a causal association with suicidal ideation and other forms of mental illness. So this is a link now that we cannot ignore. The industry is trying very hard to say that there's no, this is all, it's just people that had mental illness in their family and that had to have been what it was. But these studies, let me just say this up front because I get this question on every presentation, these studies controlled for family history of psychosis. They controlled for it. So we are really getting very close to an understanding of this link between mental illness. Here's another study using the word causal. Again, very, very surprising use of that word. So diving into youth, I mentioned I wanted to talk about Colorado and our Healthy Kids survey, because a lot of times you hear, in Colorado, they say that youth use didn't go up. That just could not be less true. So the Colorado Healthy Kids survey was just released, their latest one. It's every 2 years, I believe. The latest one was just released here a couple of months ago. And there were some key nuggets we found from it. We saw about a 6% increase in past month use for youth in Colorado, past month use of marijuana. So we are seeing an increase just from this year to 2 years ago. We're seeing alarming increases in vaporizing and dabbing marijuana, which that's how you really get the higher potency stuff. And hopefully many of you heard about the vaping crisis, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but very, very concerning. And the other thing is, I so commonly hear, if we legalize it and regulate it, at least it won't get in the hands of kids. You know, these pot shops will card just like liquor stores do. Although I think we all went to public high school, hopefully, and saw that you know, liquor stores don't keep alcohol out of the hands of anybody. But now we're, you know, seeing that, you know, reflected here with the results that, you know, about a quarter of youth got their marijuana from adults. So clearly it's being diverted even despite our best intentions. You know, these are some of the increases I mentioned. One of the biggest increases we saw and if you break down that youth demographic, is in 15 or younger. It was a 15% increase in 15 or younger kids using marijuana in the past month. So that implies monthly use. Compare that 15 or younger. Remember what I mentioned. If you start using, that research study found, if you start using marijuana under the age of 15, you're 4.5 times more likely to develop schizophrenia. So that's the link we're seeing between this data right here, is that, you know, here we're seeing our research tells us if you're under 15, you start using it, it's a problem for related to mental illness. We're seeing the increases in 15 or younger. So let's not miss that association there. I do see a question that just popped in the chat here, and I want to answer it. Somebody asked, what is dabbing? And so, you know, I'm sorry for assuming dabbing is a brand new thing, so probably most of you do not know what this is. Unfortunately, I do, being in Colorado. I would encourage you to YouTube dabbing videos. It will both nauseate and enlighten you in terms of what that is. It's very sad. You'll see youth dabbing marijuana and kind of blacking out, passing out from how potent it is. It's a really, really sad thing to watch. Basically what dabbing does is they take a little bit of very, very high potency marijuana concentrate in the palm or on a little plate or something, and then they rapidly heat it. It vaporizes. They inhale it immediately, and it just gets you very high very, very quickly. And you'll see on YouTube what the physical impact is. It's very sad if you're a parent and you're watching these young people doing this. So I mentioned, here's the dabbing numbers. We're seeing huge increases in dabbing. Usually dabbed, 178% increase, very concerning. And vaping, which we do not want to see go up right now, vaping is on the way up as well. So those are just some of the numbers there. Again, I want to remind you that 22% increase for people who had obtained it from adults. 30-day use who dab. So again, this is people like, you know, they're regularly monthly using the marijuana in the form of dabs, which again, if you look it up on YouTube, you will see how bad it is. It's increasing in Colorado and Oregon and Washington, all states that have legalized recreational marijuana, and we're seeing youth do this in this concerning way. The perceptions of risk are just plummeting among youth right now, because they're being told, I mean, you look at perceptions of risk with other drugs, you know, when you legalize something, you allow it to be promoted and advertised, which in Colorado, we are buried in advertising. We're buried in pot shops. There are actually more, you may know this, there are more pot shops in Colorado than there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined. So lots and lots and lots of pot shops. You really can't get away from it. In fact, when I was, my wife's high school that she graduated from, there's a pot shop, a couple of pot shops right on the same street as that high school. And you'll see kids for their lunch breaks hanging out in front of these pot shops. So of course they're going to have a decreased perception of risk when it comes to marijuana, because it's being sold, it's legal, and the message that we're hearing is that it's no big deal. And what we also saw, this was an interesting study that came out this year. What we also saw was that, you know, there were a lot of states that had prevention programs and other programs in place that were steadily reducing youth marijuana use over the past several years. And what we're finding now, and this research study did a great job of revealing this, is that states that have legalized marijuana have reversed those trends. They've totally set the clock back on all their efforts to reduce the youth use of this drug. So it does have an impact in terms of when and how youth are going to use. These are some other studies that you can check out when you get this in your email. What we do know for sure, though, kind of zooming out now, looking at these states, you compare non-legal states to legal states. It's not surprising. Much higher levels of use, whether you look at past year or past month. So that's not a surprise. We're seeing those increases there. This is probably, in my opinion, the most important study that we saw come out, and this was late 2019 from Serta et al. Encourage you to check this study out as well. 25% increase in cannabis use disorder among 12 to 17-year-olds in legal states. Okay, so what this is telling us is, first of all, just make sure we're all on the same page here. You can get addicted to marijuana. It is absolutely an addictive drug. It's called cannabis use disorder. You can be diagnosed with that. That's a diagnosis code that you can be diagnosed with in hospitals and doctors' offices. So it is absolutely real. And we're seeing that increase nationally across all age groups. But in legal states specifically, our youth are developing higher levels of it. So that's very, very concerning. You look at all the other drugs, we're doing a really good job at reducing youth use of cigarettes and alcohol. But there's one very glaring outlier from our success in public health, and that's marijuana use. More youth are using this, as I've said. They're using it more frequently, much more frequently, 12 to 17, 18 to 24. That's another age cohort we need to watch, because the 18 to 24 is where the really large increases are happening. And your brain is still developing up until 28, 29, maybe even 30. So at the very least 25 is what you typically hear. So that is a big concern as well. Obviously dependence, addiction, other things here. I'm gonna kind of skip through. Colorado, my state, I wanted to point out, we've been either number one or in the top three for the past 3 years in a row for youth initiation to marijuana. So more youth than anywhere else in the country, for the most part, are trying marijuana for the first time in Colorado. And that to me is very sad, very, very sad. I mentioned the vaping crisis, and hopefully we all still remember this, because not only was this a significant public health crisis late last year and in the summer of last year, but it continues because the CDC has not, a lot of us heard that it was vitamin E acetate, an additive that was added to these vaping devices, but that was only about a little less than half of the cases. We still don't know what the other culprits are. So this crisis continues. People actually have been developing this debilitating lung illness that was called EVALI. People are still developing it actually to this day, and we've seen a few articles on that just over the past 2 months. So what a lot of people don't know is that this crisis was over 80% of the illnesses resulted from marijuana vapes. Marijuana vapes. 1 in 6 of those illnesses resulted from marijuana vapes that were sold by the legal marijuana market. And if you didn't hear this, I'm not surprised, because the industry went into overdrive. We saw a lot of attempt to kind of do damage control and say, oh, it's a black market issue, it's a black market issue. But a significant portion of this crisis was directly tied to the legal industry. And not only was it just illnesses, I'll just point out that 2 deaths in Oregon were directly tied to marijuana, licensed, supposedly regulated marijuana dispensaries. So this is the impact. This was really the first marijuana-based public health crisis that our nation has ever seen. And it occurred only about 5 or 6 years into the implementation of some of these states' legalization measures. So, not a great start, just a few years in, not a great start. And we're very concerned about that public health impact down the road in other areas as well. And I just thought this article, it's worth just pointing this out. I mean, this is a guy who lived in Toledo, traveled to my state of Colorado to get his supposedly regulated marijuana because he thought it was safe. And it's just a great quote from him. Thought it was safer, especially because he never bought cartridges off the street. This was a vaping crisis victim. Again, the e-cigarette use and the marijuana vaping very much tied together. It's the same technology. It's the same device. So if you're concerned about vaping in this country, then you are concerned about marijuana as well, because it can use both. And there's obviously a lot of research yet to yet to come out on this. But there is kind of an evident link between if you are using e-cigarettes and vaping nicotine, you're actually 3.5 times more likely, according to some of the research, to report current or former marijuana use. So there is a link between vaping nicotine and vaping marijuana and kind of going on to use marijuana. I will give one anecdote. We actually have an intern, and today is actually his 2-year sober anniversary. We're very proud of him. He started with vaping nicotine. And one of his buddies, after about a year or so of doing that, said, hey, if you like vaping nicotine, you're really going to like vaping marijuana, THC. And he said, sure. So they gave him the marijuana cartridge, and then he got addicted to vaping marijuana. And that was his drug of choice. And so he fights because he wants to help prevent that from happening for other youth. He was 16 at the time. So this is what we're seeing in terms of that link. And I do see a question here, does this mean nicotine's a gateway drug? No, not necessarily. But as I mentioned before, drugs are not used in silos. So we see links between drugs and drug use. So to say that somebody's just going to one day pick up a needle and start injecting heroin, very unlikely. The research doesn't bear that out. People start with other drugs. And yes, nicotine can be the drug that people start with, but frequently it's marijuana or alcohol is another one. Marijuana vaping is on the rise. We're very concerned about that. Lots of articles on it. You look at 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. We're seeing increases in the vaping of marijuana, which we're concerned about given the crisis. The Monitoring the Future survey, which I mentioned is the second foremost survey on drug attitudes, especially among youth. They found that 1 in 4 12th graders, so about 25%, would increase their use of the drug or start using the drug if it were legalized. So we have to be cognizant of the message that legalization sends. And these are the kinds of things that are allowed to happen. And honestly, these are the tame examples of what we see here in Colorado and in other states. This is probably the nicest looking billboards that we've seen. I've seen a lot crazier ones, but don't worry, be happy, which is kind of counter psychology to the evidence, which is that marijuana is related to depression and other issues. You see how the industry is trying to normalize its products and normalize what they're doing. I do want to point out the social media side of this, because that is a very significant issue. I think a lot of parents are concerned about this for youth and how companies are marketing their products to youth. You look at the Instagram numbers. So if you're a youth, you're reporting that so youth who are exposed to ads on Instagram, marijuana ads on Instagram, 129% odds of past year marijuana use. So it's very much an effective medium for the industry to use. Now let me point out that Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, they're all trying to stop these marijuana industry companies from advertising, but they're getting around it by doing what are called social media influencers. And if you don't know what those are, basically they find somebody that, it could be a celebrity, but it also could just be somebody who has a very big following and a lot of friends on Instagram or followers on Instagram or whatever, who people respect and want to be like. And that person takes pictures on Instagram and does product placement. So clothing companies do this, and you can click a link right off the picture to buy that clothing. But the marijuana industry has become incredibly sophisticated with this, having their marijuana products in these pictures with influencers that are paying, and using that to get youth to use the drug, making it look cool. The youth want to be like the person that they're following. So that's a big issue. And I will say, and the research bears this out, the overwhelming majority of these celebrity or other influencers that the industry is paying to do these ads, you bet they are minority, they are members of minority communities, because they're targeting minority communities, just like big tobacco did and just like big alcohol had continued to do. So our Colorado Health Department report, CDPHE, found huge increases in poisonings for children 0 to 9. This was in 2019. They also issue a biannual report on this as well. I wanted to point out smoking. You see 32,000 homes where kids 1 to 14 are exposed to secondhand marijuana smoke. The American Lung Association, you can look this up, they have a great page on it, has said that the carcinogens and the effect of secondhand tobacco smoke is the same when it comes to secondhand marijuana smoke. So those are basically the same thing. Think of those interchangeably. Being exposed to secondhand marijuana smoke is a very, very bad thing, and it's something that public health experts are very concerned about. We're also seeing accidental exposures and increase in availability, triple-digit increases across the board for states that have legalized it, calls to poison control centers. Gummy bears. That's something I'd love to talk about for a second, because I think we can all agree that allowing marijuana-laced gummy bears to be sold is extreme. Clearly, that's targeting our youth, and yet they're allowed in just about every single state that's legalized marijuana. Washington State was trying to write a rule about 2 years ago to ban marijuana-laced gummy bears. They had written the rule. It looked like it was going to pass, and the industry funded a massive lobbying campaign to pull that regulation out. And in the 11th hour, they got it pulled out. So you can still buy these products on the market in Washington State, for example. And you see how it's getting into the hands of youth. There was a young girl in New Mexico who brought a bag of marijuana-laced gummy bears to school with her, and she was in elementary school. So this is something that is a big problem. And you look at the national rate for 5 and younger, it's 150% increase we're seeing now in kids being exposed to this stuff, which is a big problem. And it impacts youth not just from a health perspective, but from a future and a school and education and productivity perspective as well. Again, Lancet Journal, very prestigious journal. Another finding in 2014, if you're a regular user of marijuana and you start under the age of 17, less likely to graduate high school, more likely to develop addiction, more likely to use other drugs. Again, there's that link we're talking about. More likely to attempt suicide. So another study finding that implication there with mental illness. National Academies of Sciences, another gold standard research journal. Of a conglomeration of a large number of researchers, very widely respected. A study of 1,000 people from birth, followed these people from birth all the way to the age of 38, finding persistent marijuana use led to neuropsychological decline, more cognitive problems, stopping later in life, didn't restore healthy functioning, productivity, work, etc. These are major landmark studies that we have. So, there's this misnomer out there that because marijuana is Schedule I and it's prohibited, that somehow we don't have any research on it. Look, we're all for more research. I mean, that's why we've, supported this bill. It's about to pass the House to expand research. But we've got more than 20,000 research studies that have been done on marijuana, all peer-reviewed, all highly cited. And they tell us a lot that we need to know about this drug and how dangerous and addictive it is. And another study, several more studies, 1,200 college students found that marijuana use adversely impacted their GPA, decreased their class attendance and other college outcomes. ASU study, another big one, persistent marijuana use in high school led to lower GPAs, lower test scores, and external issues. So this clearly has a harmful impact on our youth. And then we look at the fact that youth are using it more. This is going the wrong direction right now. So those are things we all have to be thinking about. And I know that in your positions, you may think to yourself, and I'm going to wrap up here. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I think I'm good on time. But in your positions, I think a lot of times you are served up with kind of the problem side of things, and look, let's figure out the criminal justice approach to this. But it's like, as members of your community and as people with kind of really a leadership position in communities and even at the state level, it is so important that we speak in terms of reality, that we speak in terms of facts and the research. And, in this presentation, hopefully I haven't bored you to tears with all the research I talked about, but it's important that people understand this is not reefer sanity. This is not some crazy campaign to make marijuana look like it's crack and whatever else. This is just a discussion of the facts, and we understand that the impact for our youth is significant. We understand that we need to have policy that is based in the reality that this is an addictive drug with harmful potential. Does that mean that, we need to have drug war 2.0? Not necessarily. But what that does mean is we need to act on the same set of facts, and we need to make sure the public isn't fooled by marketing and rhetoric that is thrown out there. And that's where I think folks like you who are watching this today can really be helpful in speaking truth to power, not allowing people who are trying to drive a profit to use and manipulate the facts and the truth out there. So these are some great resources. My boss, Dr. Kevin Svet, wrote a great book that started this movement, Reefer Sanity. I strongly encourage you to read this. He also had a more recent book he edited and wrote in conjunction with Dr. Ken Winters. Check out these websites. Our website, learnaboutsam.org, is a great one. My email below, I would be thrilled. If you have any questions or want to reach out after this webinar discussion, I'm happy to help. We are here to be a resource to you all in the amazing work that you do, and I very much appreciate you. So with that, that's all I've got. Adam or Rachel, I will pass it on over to you. Thank you.
Great, Luke. Thank you so much. We have tons of input and questions from the audience. And I'll start with the first question, it looks like from law enforcement. And that question is, has a method of assessing being under the influence of marijuana been discussed or determined? I'm sure that's for issues of law enforcement stopping people who are impaired but don't have a method of assessment.
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest shortcomings right now when you talk about states that are legalizing marijuana. What's notably absent from all of these bills is any way to effectively roadside test for marijuana impairment. So it is a huge problem for law enforcement. I know we got a lot of people from Colorado on this call, and I think other states have legalized. I'm sure that you're aware of those issues, but we don't have a national standard for impairment. We have right now basically the way people test for this is with blood tests, toxicology results that are expensive. And it also doesn't tell us how impaired the person was at the time that they were driving, because these tests are taken later. So there are a number of companies that are trying to say they've got a great saliva test or a breathalyzer test for impairment. Nothing has been validated by science at this time. We've got no consensus in the international or national scientific community that we can move forward with. And so I would say of all the issues with our expansion of this industry, that is probably one of the biggest ones, is we've got to figure that out before even thinking about anything else.
Absolutely. That's not the answer we were hoping for.
I wish I had the easy solution there, but it's just the science is not there yet.
All right, the next question we have is, do we know what levels of current marijuana products are lethal to children?
That's a great question. I don't know that, to my knowledge, I don't know that any research studies have been done on kind of what level of THC or whatever would be potentially fatal to a child. We do have a couple of cases that have been reported on where, for example, a baby died, and there was extreme amount of THC found in that child's system. So, there was discussion of, was it directly related to THC? Was it not? So I think there are some questions around that. What I will say is we do know pregnant mothers, when they use marijuana, that has potentially fatal effects on the child in the womb, which is why the United States Surgeon General issued his advisory, really pleading with pregnant mothers not to use the drug while pregnant.
Does potency affect the time it takes to metabolize marijuana?
That's another great question. That I think there's still more research to be done on that. Off the top of my head, I don't think we have a solid answer on that question. But I think the closer we get to knowing, the answer to that question, I think the closer we get to being able to monitor for it.
Great. All right, I'm going to keep going. We have lots of great questions here. Does the age of the individual play a role in how marijuana affects them?
Absolutely. So, we do know that for youth, particularly, and not just youth, but we just got to be real here, folks. We got to get rid of this 21 mindset with alcohol, because that was a really arbitrary number that has no basis in science. Really, up until you're 25 to 28, your brain is developing. So anybody who uses the drug between the ages of 0 and 30, basically, let's just kind of be a little more broad. Most public health experts would appreciate 30. 0 to 30 is going to harm their brain's development, and it's going to increase their likelihood of all the things I talked about: mental illness, suicidal ideation, depression, productivity, cognitive functioning, etc. All those things are on the table if you use it before the age of 30. As you get older, those issues are still there. Those public health impacts are still there, just in a different way. And so, your brain's no longer developing, so you're no longer kind of what could be developed, which we'll never really know, because we can't tell the future, but you're now harming your brain with where it stands currently. And there's some issues with psychosis there, but certainly if you use it before the age of 30, you've got a lot of things to think about.
Great. Another question is, what restrictions have been implemented to prevent marijuana use from contacting those who don't want to be high? I imagine this is about in public spaces. What have you seen across the country to protect who don't want to be high who are in a public place?
Yeah, so there's a lot of question about if secondhand marijuana smoke can get you high. I've heard different thoughts on that. I think most of the scientific community would say you're very unlikely to get high from secondhand marijuana smoke. You'd literally have to be in like a hot box car. Sorry, Rachel, I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about that, but if you're in like a hot box car and it's like billowing smoke in that car, and then maybe you would get some, but very, very difficult if you're in an outdoor environment to actually get noticeably high, where you feel that. I will say, however, though, obviously there's the impacts of secondhand smoke that are serious and are a big problem. And so what states are doing on that is, they're saying, they're banning public use of the drug in some places. They're saying, that, like, for instance, you can't use it indoors or whatever. And so those are all good directions. However, they're not being enforced. And I'll tell you how I know that, because I can personally attest to that, because I take my daughter to a playground nearby, and the last couple of times I've taken her, we've had people smoking joints upwind from the playground, and that smoke is headed downwind over my daughter. And as a parent, I'm a total victim to that. And as a little kid, she's a total victim to that. So those are the things that people don't think about. And, let's be frank, law enforcement can't be everywhere at all times. They've got a lot of big fish to fry. So the idea that we're going to prevent this public use is just kind of a misnomer. It's happening. And that's just a problem. And the other thing I'll say, not to give a super long response to this, Rachel, but the other thing I'll add to that is, I talked about indoor. States like mine, Colorado, are passing laws to allow marijuana industry to set up smoking sections for marijuana in restaurants, hotels, and lounges. Blatant, and you can look me up on this, please, because it's in the title of the amendment that was passed, an exemption for the marijuana industry to the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act. So you can, if restaurants and hotels choose to, you can smoke a joint in hotels, restaurants, and lounges in Colorado. But guess what you can't smoke? A cigarette. So go figure. We're walking the clock back in a really crisp way on our public health regulations.
Next question is, what is the most common way that youth get access to marijuana?
Well, so I did have that information from Colorado. You saw about a quarter of youth are getting that from adults. And so we continue to see that being an issue. And that, by the way, we all know this, that's an issue with alcohol and tobacco too. Youth are getting this from adults. I think that's one of the key ways. Obviously, you have the dealers or whatever at the schools, and they're getting their hands on it from that. I would say those are kind of two of the big issues, and obviously from the black market.
All right. And what is the best approach for preventing marijuana usage by youth that have gotten the impression that because it's legal, it's safe?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. If I had the rock solid answer to that, I would be a lot richer than I am and probably, doing a lot of other things. But no, I mean, really, the key right now is to get the message to youth that, I don't think youth are so much interested in, unfortunately, in here's a fact sheet on what marijuana is going to do to your brain. But I do think, giving them that information in a way that resonates for them is key. And then secondarily, I think making sure they understand who's behind this push. There's a marijuana industry that is invested in by big tobacco, invested in by big alcohol and big pharma. And I'm not just saying, let me just give you an example for tobacco. Altria Philip Morris put in $2 billion in the marijuana industry. Okay, so this, and you see over my shoulder here on this side, preventing the next big tobacco. We thought they were going to be like big tobacco. We didn't think they were actually going to become big tobacco, right? So this is following the playbook of tobacco. And so for youth to know that and to know it's kind of like the Wall Street suits that are kind of pushing this, that I think is very eye-opening for youth. And we've seen that messaging really work.
All right, we have another question about detection, and that is, what are the physiological and cognitive changes that are common while a teenager is under the influence of THC? What kind of things would help law enforcement detect what's going on?
That's a great question. It really varies from person to person. I couldn't give you a great, obviously we all, know that, folks, their eyes get red and obviously they're, but it can have different impacts on different people. So it's very hard to kind of put that into a category on the spot for you. But there is some good research on that you can look up, and maybe at NIDA as well. And I know there are programs, for DREs and others to help assess for drivers if somebody's impaired. And so I recommend looking at some of those fact-based materials.
Okay. I have another question, which is, to what extent will marijuana decrease motivation to move forward in achieving goals in life and moving on with their life? I think that's something that we often hear is a side effect of marijuana use.
Yeah, well, so I gave a lot of research studies on how that's happening. Decreased GPA, decreased, job performance, productivity. There's actually some research I didn't have in this slideshow, but on, regular users of marijuana, they're more likely to have workplace accidents, absenteeism, not showing up for work because they, quote, just didn't feel like it, end quote, all much, much higher in these studies we're seeing for folks that are using marijuana. So there's a lot of impacts. But what I would say is that it's not standard, right? I mean, and the reason what I mean by saying that is, we've all probably have heard of Lil Wayne, right? And so he notoriously, again, I'm really kind of going off the rails here, Rachel, so stop me if you want. But people with Lil Wayne, they say, well, he doesn't write down the lyrics for his songs. He remembers them all, and he uses marijuana every day and raps about marijuana. And so people give those examples, and they say, well, look at him. He's quote unquote fine, and so clearly it didn't have an impact for him, so I could use it. And so what we have to understand is everybody's different, right? And so there are exceptions to every rule. Like, not everybody who smokes a cigarette a day is going to get cancer and die. But we can say that for absolute certainty, because of the research, that you've got a very good chance of it, and that a certain percentage of the population of people who do that will develop some form of cancer and will pass away early. So I think that the point with marijuana is, yeah, sure, there are the Lil Waynes of the world, and by the way, there are a lot of public, health issues Lil Wayne has that are publicly reported on. But nonetheless, there are the Lil Waynes of the world where you say, well, that person's not having any issues, but that exists for everything: heroin, cocaine, all drugs. There are people that use it for a little bit and stop, and they don't have any noticeable impact on them. So I think it's just important we note that every drug in every situation has exceptions.
All right. There's been a lot of questions here, actually, on any statistics you might have correlating marijuana use and crime. Yeah,
there are a lot of statistics that we have on that and that have been done on that. There was a study done by the University of Colorado that found if you've got a pot shop in a neighborhood, it's like about an 80% increase in property crimes, or in the houses in the neighborhoods adjacent to that pot shop. So we are seeing some research on that. It's still early. There hasn't been a ton done on it, but there's like 2 or 3 key studies that have been done so far.
Great. All right, this next question is from Mexico. It's actually in Spanish, but I'm going to translate it for you.
Very good.
Should it be necessary to regulate marijuana in the manner that alcohol is regulated by grades and quantities? So more information that comes with the marijuana.
Great question, and it's so relevant for Mexico right now because unfortunately your Supreme Court mandated legalization in spite of the fact that over 58% of people in Mexico oppose the idea of legalizing marijuana. So this is going completely against the will of the people in the country, but unfortunately the legislature is mandated by the Supreme Court to implement legalization. So you're going to see news probably today or tomorrow that Mexico's legalized it. And when you do, just remember that had nothing to do with what their constituents wanted. Everything to do with what the Supreme Court mandated. To the question about regulation, I would say alcohol is a decent model, but what I would say is you really want to treat this like big tobacco. There should not be advertising. These shops should not be able to, have any visibility on streets, corners. There should be huge images of what happens when you use marijuana on the packaging. There should be no edibles, no child-friendly products, etc. There are so many very, very stringent regulations that need to happen for this industry because otherwise what we're going to look at is a very big tobacco-like experience in the next 30 to 40 years, which we really want to avoid. So that would be our recommendation to Mexico, and I am very happy, if you have further questions, I'm very happy to answer any additional questions for your country as well.
Wow, that's fascinating news, fast breaking news from Mexico. Thanks for that. And that brings up other questions that have come up, which is, can you kind of give us a state where legalization efforts are? I think I got specific questions about Texas and South Carolina, but if you have other states, what's happening there?
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's a lot going on. So many of you probably heard about the federal vote in the U.S. House of Representatives last week on the MORE Act. And this was pitched that people said, the House voted to decriminalize marijuana, which implies that it was decriminalizing low-level possession. This was actually, unfortunately, it was a full legalization bill, which I think a lot of people didn't realize. We were actually very heartened by the fact that more Democrats than we expected voted against this bill. It did ultimately pass. However, it is not going to go anywhere in the Senate, so there will not be federal legalization of marijuana, probably not for a very long time, if ever, hopefully. But that being said, we go to the state level. We did have 4 states, New Jersey, Montana, South Dakota, and Arizona voted to legalize recreational marijuana this election cycle. So those states made that decision. So that makes it 14 states that have legalized recreational marijuana in the country. And as I mentioned before, about 30 or so states that have legalized medical marijuana by popular vote as well. So that's kind of the state of things. Going into next year, we're going to have big fights. New York is going to push legislatively to try to legalize again. We have had success defeating legalization in New York the last 2 years in a row, so we're going to be involved there again next year. New Mexico is going to be another big state. There's going to be a lot of discussion around legalization. Connecticut and Pennsylvania are also big states where there will be discussions about that in 2021 as well. So those would be the states I would watch on that front. Obviously, you always hear about new states that are thinking about it. But it's important to note that while those 4 states legalized it this year, we had 17 states in this country that rejected legalization this year. And so it's very important we note that overwhelmingly states oppose this. And so very important we know that. And it's also important we note that there's a lot of money from this industry going into these efforts. There was about $100 million total, I think, put in just over the last couple of years to legalize efforts from the industry. And it was about 400 to 1. The ratio for their spend to legalize versus not legalizing. So definitely a lot of money going into this, and it makes sense. When you've got a ROI for, if I legalize in this state, I can expand my market, that clearly there's a profit incentive for these operators.
All right, we're going to turn now to the questions we got in the chat, and the first one there is, are there studies on long-term, short-term effects of marijuana use on executive function?
Yes, and so the research studies that I put in the slideshow, and we'll send them out so you can check them out, get into that. But yes, there are long-term effects. So everything I talked about in terms of mental illness is not temporary. The psychosis is kind of an immediate onset, but the issues of suicidal ideation and depression and other things, those are things that continue into your life after you've begun using it. So it is important we know that. Yeah.
All right, I think you addressed this a little bit, but someone's asking about the difference between physical and psychological addiction to marijuana.
Yeah, that's so, basically, I think what they're getting at is kind of the physical symptoms versus the psychological kind of impact of it. So addiction is definitely a psychological, phenomenon, and it's medically diagnosed. You do have physiological responses to that. So if you're in withdrawal, for example, you'll have night sweats, cold hands, et cetera, shaking, other kinds of things that'll occur with that again vary by the person. So there is research done on that, but that's kind of typically what you associate with people in withdrawal from addiction. I'm not sure if that's what the question was, but yeah, there's kind of two different sides to that. Yeah.
All right. And then someone is asking about the FDA-approved medicines. You mentioned 2, Marinol and Epidiolex, and the third, what is that one?
There are actually more than 3. There are I want to say there's about at least a half dozen, maybe more marijuana-based medications that have been approved. I would have to look up the names of the other drugs because I don't know them off the top of my head. But the 2 examples I gave are 2 of some of the most popular ones you'll hear reference to. But again, so few people know the FDA is actually reviewing marijuana-based medications. There's this misnomer out there that because marijuana is prohibited, there's no medications and nobody can get medicine, and it's just not true. You can get federally regulated, very safe prescribed medications from your doctor that are marijuana-based, and more of those are going to be likely to be approved in the coming years by the FDA.
All right, and then there's a question here. Don't people just consume less of the more potent marijuana?
I wish. No, that's not the case at all. So in fact, and that's where I was. So that example I gave of the 33 cappuccinos versus the Diet Cola, that example was not. It's easy to mistake it. But that example was not just potency. That was the amount of THC that the average user is intaking. And so compare that to caffeine. A Diet Cola's worth of caffeine to 33 cappuccinos of caffeine. That's that much THC to that much THC. So it's a huge increase in the amount of THC that's being that there's intake for, and that's not surprising because the industry has a profit incentive for addiction. I started 2 companies that mentioned my bio. I sold one of them. So I wanted everybody to use my product, and I wanted them to use my product all the time. Thank God my product was a way to make doctors' lives easier and help them serve, and on average, about 2 more patients per day. So praise the Lord, more people were getting seen. But you take that to a drug business model, and the profit incentive is to the shareholders to deliver profits. You need to sell as much of that drug as possible to as many people as possible. So there is an incentive, a profit incentive from a business perspective to get people addicted to the drug and get them to come back and use it more. And we see that reflected in the numbers with alcohol, where the alcohol model is you have about 22% of the users are making up a little over 80% of the alcohol industry's sales. So they're making money off of alcoholics. They are not making money off of the casual, glass of wine each night user. That's not where their money game is. And so in the marijuana industry, it's very similar. That model is playing out in Colorado. We have about 27% of the users are making up about 70% of the profits for marijuana. So the more addicted users are making up a substantial piece of that revenue. So we have to kind of understand that incentive alignment. The industry is trying to drive people to use more. It's just by the definition of what these companies are.
All right, another question. Have there been any efforts to differentiate between levels of THC potency in criminalizing and decriminalizing production, distribution, and possession of marijuana? I think another way to say this is, couldn't we just decriminalize the 1970s marijuana and criminalize the current very potent marijuana? Absolutely.
Yeah, that's, a potency cap or, doing things like that absolutely is a way to do it. And there's also the argument, you've heard the argument, we're not opposed to the idea of saying, let's treat users a little bit more like, especially for those in addiction, let's, think about the drug courts model or think about other models where we can get folks who are being initiated to this drug and say, look, let's get you off of this right away and make sure they're educated. That's another approach that, people are looking at as well.
All right. And here we have a question is, are you saying that there is no responsible cannabis legalization policy that are able to address prevention of youth use, while at the same time allowing adults to make decisions for themselves?
I guess I'd like to respond to that question with another question. Do you think that we're doing a great job with alcohol and tobacco, I look at those examples and it's like I went to high school like everybody else. I mean, all my friends were drinking alcohol and smoking and, trying all the different things. So I think, we don't have a great track record with this right now with our legal drugs. Our legal drugs are killing. So alcohol kills, about 300, I think it's, tobacco kills about 300,000 people a year in this country. Alcohol kills about 100,000 people a year in this country. And then you have the opioid epidemic, and that's killing about 60,000 people a year in this country. So we don't have a great track record right now. Lots of people are dying from these legal drugs. And you compare that to the illegal drugs aren't killing even a fraction of that number per year, which tells you that, prohibiting these products actually works in terms of saving lives. Nonetheless, when you look at preventing it from getting in the hands of youth, I mean, right now you look at the numbers. I mean, I'm just looking at the facts and the data that we're getting from these states. It does not appear that any state is responsibly keeping this out of the hands of youth. They certainly don't have the resources to be able to do that. Just with the black market alone and regulating these products, there's so much money involved in implementing that, that they've got their hands full. So right now we have not seen those out. I mean, look, if I had data telling me that in every state that's legalized marijuana, or even in one, that, the youth are using it less than they ever used it before, and it's even lower than the national average, we'd be having a different conversation right now. But the fact of the matter is we're looking at we're all looking at the same numbers, and clearly that's not happening.
All right, another question. If minors are obtaining cannabis from adults, how is that a legalization problem?
Well, that's a legalization problem because it's a sign of proliferation of this drug. And the issue is more youth are using it now, and more youth are getting addicted now after legalization than before. So that's the problem. There's a lot more marijuana on the streets. There's a lot more people using it, a lot more people, getting it, and that product is then proliferating elsewhere. So, the point is, if we're trying to, prevent youth from getting access to marijuana, it's logically intuitive that we don't want there to be a lot more marijuana products in the shapes of gummies and candies and ice creams and sodas that kids all think look great to be in proliferation.
Got it. Should there be concerns that dabbing can expose individuals to byproducts of the extraction process?
Yes. And that's a big issue because people assume because this stuff is quote unquote it's state legal and it's regulated supposedly that these products are safe and that they know exactly what's in them and there's no additives. But it's like we're kind of going through the same thing as we did with big tobacco, where, the tobacco plant didn't kill millions of people and create all this cancer thousands of years ago because, people have been smoking tobacco for a really long time. We didn't have all that. When did we start to see that happen with tobacco? Well, we saw it happen about, 100 years ago when we had, the roaring 1900s. We had the supply chain model was invented and kind of introduced to business, and we had big tobacco created, the first ever global business giant that took tobacco, mixed it with nicotine and ammonia and a number of other additives, commercialized it and sold it globally. And that was where we saw the cancers come out. That was where we saw the body count start to rise into the millions and the tens of millions over the years. That's where we saw this stuff happen. And so that's kind of what we're seeing happen with marijuana. It's no longer like this plant that somebody's crushing and rolling up and putting in a joint. It's now being sent to labs and being chemically modified, and it's being all adulterated, and then it's got additives like this vitamin E acetate that we discovered for the first time ever with this public health crisis with vaping. So that is a big concern. Is the industry is doing a lot. People don't really know what the industry is doing. The state regulators have a very hard time keeping up with it. I will say in Oregon, their state Secretary of State admitted that only 3% of the pot shops in Oregon have been inspected by the inspectors for the regulatory regime. So God knows what the other 97% of those pot shops are selling or what they're putting in those products. So those are things we have to be worried about.
All right. So we have another question, which is it looks like a law enforcement officer has seen vape pens with fentanyl in Colorado. Have you seen that in Colorado? He had a serious outbreak of marijuana vape pens that were testing positive for fentanyl. And in fact, there was an unknown youth who used a vape pen with fentanyl and OD'd where he was.
Yeah, that's absolutely something that's happening. And we've seen it not just in Colorado, but in a lot of other states as well. We're seeing these products again. It's, there's like what the legal industry is doing, and then you get kind of the overlap with the black market because, everybody just assumes you legalize and the black market goes away, but the black market does not go away at all. California's market is 80% black market. Oregon's market, 70% black market. In other words, the entire state, people are buying their marijuana, 70% of them are buying their marijuana from black market sources. So the black market's doing great. It's alive and well and maybe doing better than ever. So they assume that just goes away. It doesn't. And then you have these cartels and these other black market operators that are using legalization as a front, as a cover for their illegal operations. And so that's where you'll have the fentanyls and the other kinds of contaminants and other things coming into play.
All right, so here's a participant asking if you have a definition of a policy you're referring to. Specifically, are you talking about legislative policy that each legislature votes on, or regulatory policy that regulators are discussing for after legalization happens?
I think both. I mean, I think that, from our organization's perspective, we don't want to see states or the country go down the road to commercializing marijuana because of all the things I've talked about and about 200 more slides worth of research and other things that I have that I could have presented on today. For many, many reasons, we think it's a bad idea. But if your state legalizes, or if you go down that road federally, these are all things that need to be considered. The failures of current policies, we need to find where the success would be. And right now it's hard to find, but there are certain things that are being done better than others, and we need to look at that.
All right, this next is a comment, but I think an important one to read out loud in case it was missed in the flow of the chat. It says, as a prosecutor, I take marijuana violations very seriously. I think the most important thing we have to do is educate each other about the outcomes. Once again, this is not about locking everyone up, but about addressing an active addiction issue. Every youth who is consuming marijuana has to draft an essay, I believe this is in the prosecutor's jurisdiction, and present it to our court about the adverse health effects of using marijuana on the adolescent brain. We went together on the impacts of marijuana, which helped our court understand why we had the stance we did. You can find other ways of addressing the issue from a therapeutic perspective and through education. So that's one idea for our prosecutors in the audience to address marijuana in your courtroom. That's very helpful. Thank you for that comment.
Fantastic.
And we have another question for you. You're not done yet, Luke. Does legalization have a disproportionate and or negative impact across various economic, racial, and ethnic categories?
I mean, we would be, tone deaf to say that it didn't, right? We know from some of the statistics and data that we've seen that there's absolutely a disproportionate impact on certain communities. And what I will say about this is there's a lot of talk about legalizing and commercializing marijuana as a way to resolve those disproportionate things that we're seeing take place. But what I would say is we should be cautious about that approach. And the reason why is because you look at what the marijuana industry is doing. We all know, and I wish I had this slide in my deck, and I would show it, but we all know how big tobacco targeted communities of color. And we know how, let me just dispense with this. We know where the payday loan stores are in our communities. We know where the alcohol stores are in our communities. We know where the cigarette shops are in our communities, right? They're not in the super nice rich areas. They're typically in the more vulnerable communities and neighborhoods. And what I'm going to tell you is that the marijuana industry is doing the exact same thing. In Denver, Colorado, where I'm from, Denver posted a really good study on this. There is a pot shop for every 42 residents of color in our most minority-centric neighborhoods of Denver. Okay, so that the pot shops are overwhelmingly placed in places where minority communities are. And Denver is, for anybody who knows Denver, is overwhelmingly white. So it's really astonishing that all the pot shops are in places where communities of color are congregated and not really very concentrated in areas where white people live. So it is very clear what's going on here. And the reason why is because I mentioned before, Altria Philip Morris put $2 billion into this industry. You have a whole lot of other tobacco companies that have taught the marijuana industry the playbook, and they're following that playbook to the T. So these companies are not interested in social justice. They're not interested in fixing, previous wrongs and current wrongs. And so we should not look to a commercialized legalization model to solve our social justice problems. We need to meet those problems head on and resolve them directly, because looking at legalizing marijuana, it's not going to deliver on those things.
I have a last question, which I think is actually for me, which is, our attendees who are attorneys going to receive continuing legal education credit. And I actually don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry, it's because of that I am so new with NDAA, but I know you will get a certificate of attendance for law enforcement, and I will look into whether there is CLE credits, and you'll get emails from us to that effect if there are. So that concludes all of our questions. I want to thank Luke so much for presenting here today and let you know that he's available to you as I am as resources. You have Luke's contact information here on the screen. And we would very much appreciate if you could do an online evaluation. Many of these programs, and this program is brought to you by grant funds, and an online evaluation helps us very much with the grant process. So we appreciate your time. We appreciate you learning about this issue and bringing it back to your jurisdictions and into your courtrooms, and have an excellent afternoon.
I want to thank everyone so much for the work that you do for your communities. Our organization stands behind you 110%. Any way we can be of help to you and be a resource as you contend with these problems, please let us know. But God bless each and every one of you. We pray for your safety and the work that you do to keep us safe and keep our communities safe every day. So thank you. And Rachel, it was a pleasure meeting you, and I appreciate NDAA very much for the honor of speaking today. Thank you all.
You too, Rick. Thank you.
Great. And just a couple quick announcements before we wrap up here. Thank you, Rachel, for filling in on very short notice, and Luke for your excellent presentation. As Rachel mentioned, we do have the online evaluation. That'll pop up on your screen automatically at the end here once we close out. So please stand by for that. Just a couple brief announcements. If you have questions or need additional resources, OJJDP's TTA Help Desk can provide that information to you. Again, OJJDP's Intact is also available to assist you. We have a website, and you can also sign up for our listserv via the link below. If you have a training or technical assistance need, you can submit a request via TTA 360. That training and technical assistance is available for at no cost. Again, we do have webinars posted on our YouTube page. This will also be posted on there within the next week, so please keep an eye out for that if you're interested in viewing the recording. And please take a moment to review the attribution and disclaimer slide here. And also just a reminder that we do have one upcoming event if you're interested. It's for prosecutors to improve collection and reduce contamination. With that, we will close out one quick polling question. If you could please answer that, and then we'll get you to the online evaluation. And that poll question is asking, how do you plan to apply what you've learned today in your work? And you can select more than one option here. And I'll leave that up here briefly and then close out for the survey. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.